thank you, Tanja, for joining us. Maybe you could just really quickly introduce your role and explain what you do in this exciting program.
So yes, thank you, Erica, for having me. So I'm Tanja Chopra. I'm an anthropologist, but I'm at the moment I'm working on the Expanding Access to Justice program in Somalia, which is a USAID funded program, and I'm the research team leader and part of the senior management team. So we've been doing a lot of analytical work with the primary objective to straight feed into the program and inform the program to make sure it's contextually grounded and always up to date with the latest developments.
Okay, and what is the project actually doing in terms of access to justice and the different components?
So we have designed what I think is quite an unusual program, and sort of diverts from what has been done in the past by different UN agencies and other actors in Somalia, who have mainly focused on building the formal justice sector, financing court construction, training judges, and all of the typical justice sector elements, formulating or help to draft new laws or reform existing laws and so forth. What we have aimed at is to focus on sort of the stabilization context of Somalia. And we've thought about how to provide access to justice to people right now, because when you build the formal system, you're sort of thinking much longer term. You know, this may be something that functions in a few years or a few decades down the road. There's also been quite a bad track record with interventions in the formal system, which most activities haven't had the outputs people had expected or the outcomes. So we asked ourselves, what do we need to do to provide access to justice right now in this fragile state that has a legal pluralism context where there are multiple institutions and authority providing justice in accordance to different normative systems. And so what we've come up with is three different objectives. And the first objective is to actually work at the community level with communities and make sure that communities have a voice in the shaping of their justice institutions. And we're completely unbiased here, whether those institutions are formal institutions or informal, religious, customary, whatever it is. How can we make sure that communities have an input and that you basically end up with institutions and laws or rules or norms that reflect the needs of society and reflect the current accepted norms in society, and therefore also have an impact on conflict resolution next to the provision of individual rights-based justice. So that's the first objective. And the second objective is to work with the existing institutions and to help those institutions to perform better, faster, more efficient in terms of delivering vis-a-vis different normative expectations from the justice users. So for example, we're helping to build a formal model court, which is based on a very strong court user committee that is sort of feeding in those local voices into the formal court and allows for dialogues between the different justice actors and so forth. And then we're thinking about other functionalities that the court requires, but at the same time, we're also working with other justice providers. We're working with some of the existing peace committees. We help them form justice subcommittees. So if within the peace committees, which mainly act according to the customary system or the customary norms. So if there's a sense that a justice seeker would actually require some inputs from a more individual rights-based justice forum, then the peace committee can actually get either the imam involved with Sharia or can transfer a case to formal legal aid and so forth. So we're working with all the justice institutions and providers across the board in the legally plural scenario to sort of improve their delivery vis-a-vis the needs of the clients. And the third objective is to help justice seekers in their very concrete cases to obtain the justice outcome that they desire for. So this is what in legally plural scenarios has been called forum shopping. Where justice seekers are going out and they're looking at the different justice institutions. They're thinking, where do I get what I want? Is it from the elders? Is it from the imam or the ulama, or is it from a formal judge or the district administrator or the police or whoever? We're advising through our local partners. We're advising concrete justice seekers in their case on the availability of different institutions in their area. We're advising them a bit on the context. So we try to have an understanding through our partners of what the different institutions that are available to that person can deliver. For example, is the formal judge is more trained in Sharia, and you're more likely to get a Sharia outcome rather than application of the formal legislation, and so forth. So we're helping a justice seeker to navigate all the available institutions in their area in order to find or to identify the best outcome for their cases. And this is also something where we can advise justice seekers on different norms. So most justice seekers will be most familiar with the customary system, but our partners and paralegals out in the field, they can, for example, advise the person, if you go to a Sharia-based institution, you're more likely to get an individual rights-based outcome. If you go to the formal court, these would be the laws. So we basically help people navigate their environment for their best outcome.
Okay. This issue of forum shopping is very interesting, and it came up in our class discussion. And we spoke to some of the difficulties that individual rights holders might face in being able to take their issue or their dispute to the forum that might be most beneficial to them, and that forum shopping is something that's exercised by perhaps more powerful or wealthy rights holders. Could you just explain a little bit that it can be, if you're a vulnerable group, a woman, an IDP, a minority clan member, how difficult it can sometimes be to step outside of that clan structure, particularly if you've got peer leaders who are very adamant in kind of maintaining their monopoly over dispute resolution, that, it's just not that easy to jump in a taxi and kind of go to the court and say, hey, I want to, sue my abusive husband or something. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yes, exactly. So that's a very good way of framing it. Mostly forum shopping has been framed as a negative issue because it's used by those who have the power to go and shop, basically. And what we are doing is to try and help those who usually don't have the knowledge and the access and the funding and whatever it takes to access those different fora. So we do focus on vulnerable groups in specific, and the definition of those groups really depends from area to area. So often it is women or girls or minority clan members, but a minority clan member in one area of Somalia may be a majority clan member if he moves to another area. So it's hard to define that up front. So we try to get a good understanding in the areas where we work of who the vulnerable groups are. We also have partners that work, for example, with disability groups and particularly with disabled people. We have partners that work concretely with women. But even when it comes to women, you have some women from very powerful families, whereas there are also women who come from the minority clan and they're poor, and all those, intersectionalities then usually lead to very bad justice outcomes. And this is, you're very right. So if you are, a member of a vulnerable group, it is much more difficult. For starters, you're very likely to not have the knowledge even what formal legislation or the Sharia, for example, could offer in terms of your individual rights. you're most likely to have very little knowledge. You'll be a little bit familiar with the local hair, with the customary norms, but even that will be limited. And when it comes, for example, to women, you're not allowed to address, even the family elders yourself. You would first go to the next male kin, your husband, your brothers, your father, and they would take up the case then necessarily with the elders or whoever represents the customary system for this particular case. So you wouldn't even be able, and this is quite reflective also of, there's one single female judge in Somalia. Every other judge is male. Even female lawyers are complaining that they have difficulties getting clients, because this is seen as a male thing to go to court and defend clients and so forth. And so it's very difficult along the gender lines. But then the same counts for other vulnerable groups. So if you're from a minority clan and you're poor, and you have a particular grievance, or you have a justice case, it is very difficult to just, if you go to your own elders, they will not yield the power to actually even address a more powerful opponent. And the same counts, of course, your group is very unlikely to have any relations or networks in the district administration or the police or anybody in the sort of broader justice field that could potentially just weigh in with their powers and help you with a positive outcome of the case. On the Sharia front, it depends. There's sort of, some people have access in their local communities to the imam or the ulama, but then often it's also a lack of education where people wouldn't necessarily know what exactly the Sharia would have to offer for them. So it's, there's so many multiple layers that will help you gain justice. And it really, it is not just, in the past we always assumed it was a matter of having enough funds and having time and physical access to a court, which is quite different. I mean, it really is about access to power, access to knowledge, and sort of the positioning of your family and your clan in the general social environment.
And I think Somalia's got this added kind of twist to it, this different dynamic whereby clan leaders will often assert much more power and authority than the district court judge or the court structures at the formal level, right? So if they're not willing to cede ground or cede their control over dispute resolution, they can wield that power at the courts, right, to influence the judges to refer the matter back to the community level.
Yes, exactly. So it's for example, a very typical cases that is in terms of SGBV cases of sexual and gender-based violence cases, rape cases, for example, where families struggle to actually get them to the formal court. And then what you will often find is that the elders come in through the back door and tell the judge to simply hand this case back. And the case goes straight back to the customary authorities and is out of the formal court. On the other hand, also the formal judges also often lack formal education in legislation. They may have education in Sharia law. In some cases, they may not have that education at all. So even going to the formal court, you're actually it's quite unpredictable of what the outcome will be. Mm-hmm. But what you just mentioned is very important. So in most of the rural areas, definitely, where courts exist, they're actually quite irrelevant, and justice is handled by the customary leaders, by the family elders, with Sharia representatives weighing in. But it is a lot also determined by the local administrators, by the police chief, and so there's a completely different set of people that will determine justice outcomes, and only where a party, for example, feels that they have a close affinity to the judge at the formal court, or they're powerful and they know that they will get their best outcome through the court will actually be addressed. So you find that in many areas, also where we have done research, response is usually that barely any cases go to the court. They're just not relevant. And in Mogadishu or some of the other urban centers, you will find the same. I mean, you will find that courts are applied when they're promising for one of the aggrieved parties, but in every other case, people will not address the courts.
Okay. Just to switch track a little bit, another thing in class that we found quite compelling was this idea that some of the practices, the customary hair practices that are difficult to reconcile with human rights norms, they're often grounded in the context of the Somalia situation, whether that's fragility, lack of security, poor access to state services. Would it be possible to speak a little bit to this, that, practices that seem abhorrent from an outsider perspective, that it's much more complicated and that you really have to view these, particularly when you're looking at modalities for how you might influence them or reform them, you really need to place them in their broader social, economic and cultural context?
Yes, thank you for saying this. This is one of the key issues working in these legally plural environments. So customary justice has developed out of a long history of social, economics, political needs and structures on the ground, and customary norms and values and ideas often reflect quite closely where a society stands, and what the socioeconomic circumstances in a society are, and this is what makes it so problematic to then come, as a justice reform practitioner, to come, or an outsider in that regard, to come and simply build a formal court system, a formal judiciary that is completely unrelated from social structures and political structures and all of that. And so there's no relation between the two. And this is a classic issue that we've learned in 30 years of doing justice sector reform in fragile states. These two often end up not being connected, and therefore this formal system will just be used and abused as sort of local structures are dictating it, and local power structures are dictating it. And what is often happening is that, customary norms are simply, they're called abhorrent, and we've had so many studies worldwide on customary justice systems, and they all come out with the same findings. They usually say they're against women's rights, and they're not good for disadvantaged people, and they're against human rights principles and so forth. And that's all very simple, but what one needs to understand is that those local systems or customary systems are really much more in tune with society, and they often reflect what society needs. And as society changes, different demands are put onto the customary system, and the customary system will always lag a little bit behind those demands, because it will change and it will adjust, but it is always a little bit slower. And what's been happening in the recent years is that you have quite a rapid development through, Somalia, Somalis having much more access to other norms and ideas, to international human rights principles and all of that. Diaspora members coming back, bringing in new thoughts and ideas. Social media is very popular. There's a lot of access in Somalia. So society changes, and so society has different demands, or certain societal groups start having different demands, and the customary system cannot quite cope with those demands, and it's all happening very rapidly. So the customary system hasn't been able to rapidly adjust to those new demands, and then what you have is really a clash of different norms, and the key idea is that you can't just come in and law, because the customary norms still play a very crucial role in society. So on the ground, in whenever there are disputes developing, there's always that customary element that needs to handle those disputes, because otherwise they get out of control, and you'll have revenge killings that go on for years and years and years, in the worst cases. So the customary norms are very important on the ground to cater for a certain level of societal tension. While on the other hand, there is now demand to also have access to those individual rights norms, to international human rights principles, and all of that, which is much better catered for by the Sharia, by the formal legislation, and so forth. And this is where sort of the main contradictions arise, and where it becomes very, very difficult to work on justice sector reform in Somalia. Just to give the example of a sexual and gender-based violence case again, you can take a rape case to the court and push it through the criminal system, but there will always be a social problem left, because there will always be tension between the two families that will not be dealt with by the handling of the criminal system. And those tensions on the ground will only cease when customary actors have become involved, when some form of payment has been made to the survivor's family, and so forth. So you have many cases where actually you need application of multiple systems to handle the multiple facets of a single case.
Right. That provides a great segue to my next question, because everything that you're saying, it kind of begs the question of, if a customary practice is rooted in an economic reality, or, for example, a security deficit that's going to be very hard to reform until that deficit is fixed, it kind of begs the question of, well, what do you work on first? It would make more logical sense to fix the security deficit that is giving rise to the customary practice, as opposed to try to work on the customary practice, which, as you rightly said, maybe not very effective. But then that creates a problem, doesn't it? That if fixing the security, economic, social problem could take a number of years, where does that leave the international community, or you as a programmer? Do you just need to stand by and wait and observe these rights violations going on? It puts people that are in charge of programming in quite a difficult position, right? So I'm wondering, kind of, how do donors respond when you explain this reality to them and say, hey, this is an incremental, segmented kind of process. We need to restore security. We need to have viable access to the court system before you can expect these customary processes to fall away.
Yes, exactly. So it's a much longer term process. It's also, of course, you have to look at it in a holistic way, right? As you said, you need to do security sector reform in a positive way, while you're doing economic empowerment. So it all really goes together, and this is what sort of initial stabilization approaches also try to do, to sort of see everything in a much more integrated picture, rather than just carving out access in specific sectors and focused on those. So you're absolutely right. All of this needs to be seen holistically. Theoretically, we need to work on everything at the same time, which in a way is very difficult, and funding is not sufficient, and implementation is often not of high quality to produce all of these outcomes. So given all of that, as a programmer, I find sort of that there's got to be a short-term and a medium-term solution, which simply means which is what we're doing in our program, is just provide access to justice right now with whatever means are available. And if it means we need to call in the elders to handle the community front, while at the same time we're working with the Sharia representatives to also get a bit more of a rights-based outcome, and this needs to go in conjunction with each other, then that is what we have to do in the short and medium term. just on a side note, we've also felt in the program that working with a Sharia is actually much more helpful than putting too much emphasis on the formal secular legislation, because the Sharia is actually something that is culturally acceptable for everybody. And if you come with an argument that is based on the Sharia, even the elders and the broader community will accept it. Whereas if you come with arguments that derive from your formal legislation, it is sometimes very difficult to give it any meaning at the community level. So we're really looking at what is appropriate on the ground as programmers, and what can you do in the short term to just deliver access to justice, which means to, also be able to maintain a certain, or build a certain stability and peace in local communities right now.
Mm-hmm.
But also sort of on a broader picture from what you've just been saying, I also see the donor community in the last couple of years. I've seen the donor community actually move further away from those integrated stabilization approaches that look holistically at all different issues. And I think that there has been a change where sort of donor countries have opened up a lot more about their personal or their own political interests. They're moving further away from holistic governance approaches. They become much more focused on security. Security sectors is definitely very popular, because that's also something that is required for other countries' support and interventions in Somalia. And so interventions become a lot more focused and concrete on certain areas, and there's actually a shift away from more integrated approaches. So what you've just mentioned actually really is sort of an ideal, which I think we're moving away from, and it will become a lot more difficult in future to successfully program in that way.
And just a technical clarification. So you mentioned the standoff, that it's sometimes a lot easier to work with Islamic Sharia as opposed to the statutory system. But in at least the Somaliland, Puntland, and the government of Somalia, Sharia is the basis of statutory law, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So this is what makes all of this more difficult and more easy even in different ways. So Somalia has decided, and that's quite a precedent. There's only, I think, 3 other countries in the world that have made the Sharia the basis of any justice in their countries. And Somalia is therefore quite unique. But what Somalia hasn't done, it hasn't really defined what this means. It hasn't defined which school of jurisprudence in the Sharia is applied. It hasn't built up the educational system around this. It hasn't reformed its laws and courts and judges to comply with this. So there's a constitutional framework that basically says nothing should contradict the Sharia. But all of this has not been, it's not thought through. It's not implemented in that way. But as a programmer, we feel that by pointing people to the Sharia and starting to work with the Sharia, we're actually helping the country to make this happen on a longer term basis.
Okay, and I guess just one final question that leads on from that. We've discussed when we've worked together previously, the preferred jurisprudential school is the Shafi one, which is not exactly one of the most easiest schools to work with from a rights perspective. So given that you have enormous challenges inherent in the HERE system with respect to rights, and then the legal system is based on Islamic jurisprudence and potentially the Shafi madhab. How do donors kind of get their heads around this? Is it easy? Are they conflicted? Do these kind of challenges come up from a programming perspective that maybe governments don't want their donor funds used to be building up quite a conservative Sharia court system?
So what we are doing right now is we're not funding the Sharia. So what we do is we we did research to sort of look into what is the Sharia jurisprudence, what are the different elements that actually can help a woman, for example, make the case for her access to justice. We've pulled those out and we've put them into simple documents just to help people on the ground when they want to make a Sharia argument to say, well, here, in this jurisprudence, it actually says, that I should inherit X, Y, and Z as a woman. So we try to be really, really concrete and just to support access to justice for vulnerable groups with those particular pieces of different jurisprudence. It hasn't come to the higher level discussions on which schools will be part of the system. But the way that we've communicated this to donors is also to say, look, this is actually a moment where donors can still have an impact and can facilitate and support these discussions in Somalia, and can help that the schools that do get applied are actually those which are more friendly towards and more supportive of international human rights standards. And so rather than not engaging in this issue, we should be engaging, because then we can mainstream human rights a lot more than if we just let things happen by themselves. And even sort of when it comes to countering violent extremism and supporting, you're also aware, for example, that there are quite a number of, Al-Shabaab has become very popular in providing justice. And this is, for example, something that donors are very interested in stopping and preventing, in order to counter violent extremism. And so one of the arguments is to say, well, you can compete with those Al-Shabaab run courts by actually providing justice that people find culturally appropriate. And this is why we're reaching out to the Sharia as opposed to the old British and Italian formal laws, because the Sharia is culturally much more accepted. And therefore, by trying to prevent violent extremism, it is actually very important that we work with what people find legitimate on the ground. So, and those have been the key arguments. And I have to say that quite a number of donors are becoming very interested. There's sometimes a bit of hesitation of how that could be reflected in their home capitals. But I think that more and more donors are actually understanding those arguments and are becoming very interested in more refined work on and with the Sharia.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an interesting perspective, right? And I mean, if we go back 10 years or so, I mean, we see that donors were equally reticent to engage with customary systems. They were deemed, this abhorrent form of supporting justice, and that we should just put all of our thinking and resources into the court. And certainly that has changed over the last decade or so. So it's interesting to see engagement with Islamic jurisprudence is kind of on a similar trajectory. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And it's great to, get the perspective of somebody that actually works with this on an everyday basis. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much for inviting me.